what makes a distribution be ready and delivered at the end user?
Yeah, it's actually a good question to ask because a lot of people get confused on what a Linux distribution is. And they often think that a Linux distribution is created only by one company. And the reality, it's created by the community. So the community creates the components that make up a distribution. And then the distribution vendor takes the components from all these different products and actually builds a product or a technology. It's very similar to how a car is built in many ways. And if you look at Linux and you look at cars, there's a lot of similarities behind it. Linux itself is the kernel. It's the core engine of what makes the operating system work. And that's just like the engine in a car. And Linux is controlled by the Linux Foundation. It's an open source organization that focuses just on the kernel, just on the engine of what makes Linux Linux. But an engine without anything else doesn't do you any good. And that's where distributions come in. The next major component is, I call it transmission. And that's a lot of software that comes from the GNU, the GNU Foundation, and their organization. And they produce a lot of the commands that we're used to, like ls and cp and awk and grep and all these other basic commands that you need in order to do something with a kernel, how you interact with the kernel and how you interact with basic files. And that's done by GNU. But then you add on a whole bunch of other things into the distribution, and it's just like a car. You need seats. And there's many different companies that make car seats. Well, in Linux, maybe you need a database. There's many different companies that make databases for Linux. You have Postgres, you have MySQL, you have Oracle. Microsoft makes a database, and those are relational databases. Then you can get into the non-relational databases and the niche databases, but there's a lot of folks building those technologies. And then you might need something like an airbag to protect you. Well, that's security software. And you have a lot of things that come from different organizations to make security software. You have tools like OpenSCAP. You have tools like SE Linux that come from different organizations that build and maintain these technologies. And then you add in all the other bits that make up a car. You need doors, windows, you want an alarm system, you want seat belts. You have things like the Apache Foundation that makes the Apache web server that we use, but it makes a lot of other technologies that we use. You have the folks at Nginx that make a more simple web server that's often used in conjunction with Apache, and that comes from their organization. So what a distribution builder does is kind of like a modern car company, where most modern companies don't really make the car, they source the pieces. So they get the airbags from one company, the brakes from a company, the seat belts from the company, the actual car seats from another company. And then they have their own sheet metal shops that kind of build the look of the car. And that's kind of what you have in a distribution, is you have companies like Red Hat that they take the open source components from thousands of different projects and people and put that together in a distribution, and that's their car. It's no different than you buy a Ford or a Chevy. And as a lot of people know that work with those cars, the same brake pads work in both. The bolt holes might be different, but they're made by the same company. And some of them are even interchangeable. It doesn't matter if it's a Ford or a Chevy, it's going to be the exact same part, the exact same bolt holes. So that's kind of what a distribution does, is it bundles all these different pieces and puts it together so it's easier for you to consume and deploy and use.
That's an amazing description of how a distribution works. This reminds me of a good analogy from Jeff Geerling as well about Red Hat, where, correct me if I'm wrong, so it works like Red Hat would grab a copy of Linux, they would add magic sauce that makes it Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and they would release a new version, they would update a source code repository with all the data required to build from scratch. And there you go. This is how it works. But one more question I would like to ask is, it's of course bundling all those packages, but there is still something that Red Hat is doing in order to make that distribution at the end. So they decide on the version of that binary that will be wrapped or shipped with the distribution. They do patches as well. Could you tell me more about this part that Red Hat still does on top of gathering all those packages?
Absolutely. So Red Hat, like any distribution, is picking things or picking major versions like Apache 2.4 or Bind version 8 or whatever the technology is, or the Linux kernel itself, right? It could be a version 3 kernel, a version 4 kernel, a version 5 kernel, or even a version 6 kernel. So they're picking those major components, but a lot of those components, they're not even building. You know, the Linux Foundation actually builds the kernel, and sometimes Red Hat contributes a lot to the kernel, but there's also other cases like there's times where Oracle contributes more to the kernel than Red Hat does. So it's a lot of different companies. And even like an example in the kernel, even companies you might not even think about contribute to the kernel. You know, you have Intel contributing to the kernel, AMD contributing to the kernel, Samsung contributing to the kernel. There's all sorts of companies that produce that code. The Linux distribution organ who build that distribution basically picks the versions behind it, but they don't necessarily pick the patches either. Since all these are built in open source, it comes from what's called an upstream provider. So in open source, you have upstream and downstream, and upstream is the source of truth. That's the organization or the people that are building the core technology. So with upstream, you might have something like the Linux kernel that comes from the Linux Foundation. You could have something for an Apache web server that comes from the Apache Foundation. You could have something that is like Zeek, that's an open source security tool that comes from the Zeek.org folks. They actually, as part of that technology that that group is building and maintaining, they actually take patches that are contributed to their project to fix security bugs, to add new functionality, is the upstream provider. And then downstream are folks like Red Hat that take those patches, they take the new versions, which a patch is really a new version at that point, and they add it to their distribution. Now, in Red Hat's case, just like Oracle and just like even Facebook, a lot of these companies that build distributions also contribute to the underlying source that builds the technology. So you might have something like the XFS file system that Oracle contributes heavily to. That's put in where then Red Hat might take that code from that team that builds the XFS file system and puts that in their distribution as the primary file system for it. The patch didn't come from Red Hat. More often than not, it came from Oracle in that example. But it could be also a video driver that comes from NVIDIA as an example. And they basically are bundling it together, taking the versions, deciding what versions, curating the versions that go into it. In Red Hat's case, they do put a lot of money into developing and supporting some of these open source projects, like they did with the CentOS project as an example, and Fedora, which are more around distributions. And they do a lot of work also with some of the lower level technology, but they're not the only player that generates that content. It's produced by a large number of people.
So jumping on what you just said about spending a lot of money in contributing in open source projects, I have a candid question related to the contribution of Red Hat toward their own customers. So I've heard, or I think I read somewhere that Red Hat also makes sure that every new feature or patch is sort of retro compatible with the old version. I don't know if you can explain that better. So there's some work that's done by Red Hat in order to make sure that whatever is applied today on something is compatible on older version of Red Hat that are still being used by their customers.
It actually doesn't work that way. Generally, when a patch comes out from whoever Red Hat is an example, they have a baseline where this patch works for 8.8, and you have to be on 8.8 for this patch to work with everything else in the ecosystem. But if you're on 8.7, the patch doesn't work, and you might you're forced to upgrade to 8.8 in order to get that patch. So it's not really its old versions, it's just that specific version of the distro at the time it was released. And you also have things for breaking things. That can also be a challenge because you could have a technology like Redis, which is a database technology. It falls in the database family of technologies, that actually multiple versions could be distributed by the distribution, by Red Hat or Oracle or Alma or Rocky or whoever. One might be in the EPEL repository and one might be in their main repository. And those two are not compatible. So it's a little more than just saying that they curate it. They do, but it doesn't always mean it's going to work. Sometimes patching, especially when they're doing version updates, major version updates, break things. And that's a little bit of a challenge as a Linux admin. You have to kind of understand what those are. where the distro builders work is they do some base testing there, but often that base testing is around a specific version, 8.8, 8.9, 9.1, 9.2, etc. And when you get outside of that version, it's no longer necessarily going to be compatible with everything else that's in the newer release.